Hello, welcome to the Be At A Bunch podcast, where we're going to talk about important revolutions and the impact they had on society and their communities. The Cuban Revolution was an armed revolt conducted by Fidel Castro's revolutionary 26th of July movement. But what led to this, and what happened during and after this revolution? Today, Philip and I are going to discuss the Cuban Revolution and its impact on the world. Before we get into the revolution itself, we must first talk about what led up to the revolution. In 1940, a Cuban nationalist who was starting to form a democratically organized Cuba named Fulgencio Batista was elected president. And during his 4-year reign, he got support from all the progressive parties. During this time, Cuba was doing very well. But in 1944, Batista's reign ended, and he went off to America. He lived in New York for a few years, and he wasn't seen again until 1952. In 1952 is when he decided to run for president. This is important to note because elections are coming up and Batista wants power again. And this is where we're introduced to Fidel Castro. Castro grew up in an upper-class family, owning plantations and working in American corporations. This upper-class money sent him to one of the best schools in Havana. During this time is where Fidel would start to gain a moral compass, learning about democracy and how people should be living freely, eventually propelling him to go into politics. In 1952, Fidel Castro decided to run for president as well, and this is where our two figures meet. Castro wanted to change Cuba from the inside, and when Batista figured out he wasn't going to win this election, he organized a military coup supported by the USA, and he took control of Cuba by force. During this reign, Batista was different. He was aligned with the American government, the American mafia, and American corporations. Notice how much influence and control America had over Cuba during his reign. 90% of oil, 80% of utilities, 80% of cattle, and 40% of all sugar were all controlled by America working with Batista. Batista was building casinos and other things to make Cuba a paradise for Americans. And although that might be good for Americans, that wasn't good for Cuban natives. Castro was appalled by this, and this is the exact opposite of what he thought Cuba needed. And if he couldn't stop it by getting elected, there was only one other way: starting a revolution. In 1953, July 26th, Castro started a movement bringing 120 men to attack the army barracks on Santiago de Cuba. This was an attempt to overthrow Fulgencio Batista. The movement fought the Batista regime on both rural and urban fronts. It was a hard-fought battle, but Fidel Castro and his men lost, most of them being executed, leaving only Fidel and his brother. They both fled to Mexico, but the fight wasn't over. Now in Mexico, Fidel and his brother plot a comeback, and on December 2nd, 1956, Fidel and 82 men head for Batista on a large wooden boat called the Grandma. But they were spotted, and 60 out of the 82 were killed. Fidel and the remaining men fled to the Sierra Maestro Mountains. This would be Batista's critical error, because during his time in the mountains, Fidel's numbers grew from around 22 to around 300. In a panic, Batista tried to stop this by sending an assault to the mountains, but this failed. Both of these assaults are known as the Battle of La Plata and the Battle of Las Mercedes. After Fidel and his men leave the mountains, they begin taking towns one by one, joining other revolutionary groups as they do so. On December 1st, 1958, the Battle of Santa Clara happens, and after losing again, Batista takes off to the Dominican Republic. Batista's army lays down their weapons, and in 1959, Fidel and his men march into Havana. That's the end of the revolution. Although being the end of the revolution, it wasn't the end of the impact that the Cuban Revolution had. But I'll leave that conversation to Philip.
As you now know, the Cuban Revolution was a very long and hard-fought process. The rebels had to overcome many hardships, all in hope for the better of their lives of their people. Fidel Castro was able to fuel the future of Cuba and recreate its government for a better tomorrow. In just the first decade after the revolution, issues like education, medical care, and discrimination were all tackled in an effort to create a new life for all Cubans. Universal accessibility to free education was an issue that had gone on too long, with over 20% of people over the age of 15 being illiterate. This had gone on to change over the next decade, with Cuba spending over 100 times more on education than they had in 1959. And after the 1960s, every child was able to receive education. That was a huge step forward compared to the stats before 1959, where less than half of Cuba's child population could not receive education. Cuba's medical care was also having issues, which led them to establish a rural medical service program. This employed 750 physicians and medical students in rural areas to allow people who would not normally have any care to get the supplies and help they needed. Discrimination against Afro-Cubans had also become a complication, stemming from the arrival of Spaniards and their African slaves in the late 1400s. Anti-discrimination legislations were passed to help better the lives of Afro-Cubans, which was later counterattacked by a newer legislation that made it illegal to even mention racial equality or discrimination. Cuba was able to get all of these reforms and changes done even with the embargo that the U.S. had set against it due to the fear of communism insurgency spreading out, which would harm the capitalist nation. This embargo was set on all food and medicine, making it extremely hard for Cuba's economy to flourish, stopping it from gaining any power economically. This embargo still stands today, restraining Cuba from becoming a financially independent country. The impact of the Cuban Revolution shows just how powerful a movement can be. Revolutions can impact people in many different ways, both good and bad, as we can see with the new reforms for the betterment of Cubans and the hard-fought battles and lives lost to get there.
Well, that was the Be Out a Bunch podcast, and I hope you learned something new today. Thank you for listening.
Like